Come to the place where abundant lives abide. Come to the place where you will find new life.
Those of us who are involved in public performances, whether dancing or singing or public speech, are attempting to communicate a vision. And we must admit that public performances are at once an art form and a science. Concerning the work that I do, those who study public speech, whether a lecture, an address, or a sermon, are universally agreed that they're composed of basically three elements: an introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Someone has oversimplified that by saying that in the introduction, you tell them what you're going to tell them. In the body, you tell them. In the conclusion, you tell them what you told them. One preacher inquired of another as to how he amassed and maintained such massive crowds Sunday after Sunday. The preacher replied, he says, I work assiduously and painstakingly on my sermons so that I craft the most imaginative introduction that I can and the most appealing and compelling conclusion. And I put the two as close together as possible. My mother said to me in the long ago, she said, son, when you preach, do not make the people glad twice. Glad when you stand up, and glad when you sit down. But more specific to the work that I do, I'm not certain that you can just automatically put a sermon in that convenient category of introduction, body, and conclusion. I raise that issue because if the preaching is authentic, if it is true, then the sermon actually has to be shaped by the text. That is, the way the message is delivered is formed by the particular shape of the text out of which it comes. Now, that's particularly challenging, and that's a daunting task when you attempt to preach the words of Jesus. Jesus' words were so succinct, so direct, but they were deceptively simple. History proves that because you can preach thousands of sermons and write volumes of books on the few brief, terse remarks and all their simple profundity and profound simplicity from the lips of the carpenter of Galilee. This text, from the time I wanted to preach on it, has plagued me from the beginning. I've always found this pericope troubling because this text and the shape of it leads me to think that if you say too much about this text, you will do violence to it because Jesus said so little. He told these two simple stories. So to elaborate, to elucidate, to go on and on and on about these verses, so brief, so terse, would do violence to what Jesus was attempting to communicate. So I'm forced in the preaching journey today to say, for example, that this does not fit the normal pattern because there really is no conclusion. Does not need a conclusion. And so this sermon has no conclusion. It speaks for itself. It's its own conclusion. It's inescapable. It's almost sufficient to just read it and be done with it. So I must come directly at this text. The principle here, and I hope to God that you're listening to me. The principle here is so simple and inescapable. Many times, Sean, when we preach, we want to take the concepts and the words of a text and somehow wrest them from their, not just their context, but from the meaning of the text, and give it a kind of thrust that the preacher feels is necessary. That might border on misinterpretation. For in this text, Jesus is not trying to tell us what most pulpits are full of, must and ought. He is not telling his listeners that you must seek the kingdom or that you ought to seek the kingdom. As a matter of fact, he is not encouraging anybody to seek the kingdom. Not in this text. There's no must in here. Isn't that how we preach? You must do this. You ought to do that. You ain't doing this. You ain't doing that. Don't use Jesus for that. That's not what he's doing here. Nor is Jesus trying to sell us as to the value of the kingdom. Too much of our preaching has reduced God to a car salesman. Reduce God to standing on the corner saying, we'll work for members. The King of Kings, we got him acting like he's begging somebody to work for him. You ought to come to church. Wait. Excuse me. Don't talk about God like that. Like he's begging somebody to buy his product. Like he's holding up a sign, I sure wish somebody would come to my church. No. Hear what Jesus said. He ain't trying to sell you the kingdom. And he ain't even telling you to go looking for it. Jesus is teaching us how you act when you found the kingdom. That's what he's telling us. Let me break it down to you. If you've got to constantly convince your man to treat you right, you got the wrong man. If you constantly engaged in browbeating your wife about how she treats you, you got the wrong woman. She don't realize what she's got. If a pastor has got to stay on his people, do this, do that, he got the wrong church. If a church has got to beg that pastor to do his job, you got the wrong pastor. It's just that simple. So look at the text. Look at it. Look at it. Look at what Jesus is saying here. It's so simple, it's scary. Jesus said in the first instance that there was a man, and the man was working in a field, and he found a treasure. And when he found the treasure, he hid it. Now that doesn't make sense, does it? He hid it, then he went and he purchased the field so he could own the treasure. It's not hard to understand. In rabbinic law, if you found a treasure in my field, it belonged to me. So when he found, you ain't getting this, or maybe you are. When he found the treasure, joy filled his heart, so he went and liquidated all that he had so he could buy the field and get the treasure. Notice what's not in the text. Nobody told him, man, you see how valuable that is? Preach, Taylor. You see how, man, you need to buy that. There's nobody in the story but him. He saw the treasure and said, wait a minute, I'll give up everything I have for this. I met this lady when I was in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And I was a young, skinny, handsome, debonair playboy. Girls falling at my feet and knocking on my door. That's enough of that, bitch. That's enough of that. That's too much information. But when I met Lisa V, I sold everything I had. Just trying to make it plain to you. He sold everything he had. Now, he didn't want the field, he wanted the treasure. That's where some people get upset about church. I'm not interested in the field, I want the treasure. That's why some people get upset and leave the church. You too caught up with the field, you need to be concerned about the treasure. Yeah, the treasure. He didn't want the field, he wanted the treasure. And he sold everything he had, liquidated all of his assets, went for broke to get the treasure. And when he bought the field, the treasure was his. The second instance is a man, I like to think this merchant was a jeweler. That seems to make more sense to me. A jeweler merchant, looking for that perfect pearl. It is interesting that in this culture, pearls were wanted and desired not just for their value, but for their beauty. They loved pearls and placed a high premium on pearls. And so, some pearls, we're told, were found at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and some you had to go all the way to faraway Britain to get the pearl. But this man, one day, ran upon a pearl so beautiful, so exquisite, so perfect in form, that he did the same thing his counterpart did. He liquidated all of his assets to get that pearl. It was that important to him. When he found the treasure, when he found the pearl, nothing that he had was important to him anymore. He gave it all up. That's how you know when you found the kingdom. When you find the kingdom, nobody will have to ask you to give up anything. Because when you find the kingdom, you will soon recognize it is of so much more value than anything you have right now. You will gladly give it up. So, don't beat up on yourself. Don't be hard on yourself. When you hear Christ say, give this up, or give that up, or do this, or do that, if you say, Lord, I just can't do it, nothing's wrong with you. You just haven't found the kingdom yet.